She had 17 seconds between the sound of the laughter and the moment she decided not to turn around. She counted them the way she counted everything, precisely, privately, with the quiet attention of someone who had long understood that the world does not reward its noticers. The laughter came from the doorway behind her. 3 voices braided into one sound, and it carried the particular sharpness of people who believe they are being observed by someone who matters. She did not give them the satisfaction of her shoulders stiffening. She let her hand continue its path along the spines of the books, her fingertips reading the ridges of gold leaf and cracked leather the way a pianist finds keys without looking. She knew these books. She knew them the way a mother knows the breathing patterns of her children in the dark. The 3rd shelf from the top, the one that required the rolling ladder no one in this house seemed to use, held 4 volumes she had written before her 30th birthday. The 2nd shelf held 6 more. She said nothing. The laughter said everything it needed to about the women in the doorway, and silence said everything it needed to about her. The Duke's library occupied the northeast corner of the house, a room that had been a ballroom in his grandfather's time and had been converted with the kind of money that does not announce itself. The shelves were walnut, hand-carved, fitted to the walls as though they had grown there. The carpet was Turkish, old enough to have softened into something like moss underfoot, and the windows faced the garden where, 3 hours earlier, she had stood with a glass of champagne she did not drink and listened to a woman in green silk explain to the table that serious scholarship was simply not possible for the female mind, not in the way it was possible for men, not with the same rigor. The woman in green silk had smiled while she said this, the way people smile when they are repeating something they have heard from someone they consider important. Eleanor had smiled back. She had not argued. She had learned, years ago, that arguing with people who have already decided what you are is like trying to fill a cup that has been turned upside down. You waste what you are pouring. Eleanor Ashworth was not, by the standards of this gathering, a notable guest. She had been invited because her cousin Margaret was married to the Duke's younger brother, and Margaret, who was kind in the way that occasionally borders on carelessness, had mentioned that Eleanor might enjoy the weekend. Might enjoy. As though Eleanor were a child being offered a sweet. As though the library she now stood in did not contain more of her own words than any other private collection in England. She had published under the name E.L. Ashworth for the philosophical volumes, and under the name Eliot Ash for the literary criticism, and under no name at all for the 2 anonymous essays on political reform that had been attributed, variously, to 3 different men, one of whom was dead. The dead man's family had not corrected the attribution. They seemed pleased by it. Eleanor did not begrudge them this. She had not written for the attribution. She had written because the ideas were there, large and restless, and she could no more have left them unexpressed than she could have left a wound unbandaged. The 3 women in the doorway were moving on now. She heard the rustle of taffeta, the click of heeled shoes on the marble of the hallway, and one last murmured comment, something about odd creatures and the smell of old paper that was clearly meant to be overheard. Eleanor let it pass through her like weather. She had 17 published works, 4 languages, and a correspondence with scholars across the continent. She did not require the good opinion of women who found libraries odd. What she required, at this particular moment, was 10 uninterrupted minutes with the volume on the 4th shelf, 3rd from the left, because she had spotted an error in the 2nd printing that she had been trying to confirm for 6 months. And the Duke's copy, she suspected, was a 1st edition. She reached for the latter. The room smelled of beeswax and aged paper and something else. Something green, the garden coming through the cracked window. Late afternoon light fell in long panels across the floor, catching the dust motes that her movement had stirred. She climbed 3 rungs, 4, and there it was. The spine was unmarked by handling. The Duke, it seemed, had not read this one. Or he had read it so carefully that he had left no trace, which was a different kind of attention entirely. She drew it from the shelf with both hands, the weight of it familiar, the slight give of the binding against her palms like a handshake from a former self. She opened to page 214. There it was, the error, a misplaced comma that altered the meaning of an entire argument about the nature of civic duty. She had caught it in proof and been overruled by the typesetter, who had insisted she was mistaken. The typesetter, who could not read Greek and had therefore not understood that the clause required a different pause. She closed her eyes briefly. Confirmed. 6 months of wondering settled in 4 seconds. She allowed herself a small, private smile, the kind that costs nothing and is worth everything. She did not hear him enter. This was unusual for Eleanor, who noticed most things: the shift of air in a room, the particular quality of silence that means someone is listening, but she was absorbed, turning pages now, reacquainting herself with arguments she had built a decade ago, and the carpet was thick, and he moved quietly. The Duke moved the way certain large men move when they have learned that their size can be a kind of intrusion, deliberately, with a consciousness of space. She became aware of him only when the quality of light changed, his shadow falling across the page she held. She looked up. He was standing 6 feet away, near the wing chair by the cold fireplace, watching her with an expression she could not immediately read. It was not displeasure. It was not the amused condescension she had learned to expect from men who found women in libraries. It was something else, something closer to recognition, though that made no sense, because they had not been introduced. He was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and had settled into something more interesting, angular, watchful, marked by the particular attentiveness of someone who reads. She knew this because she recognized it. It was the same look she saw in her own mirror, the look of someone who has spent more time with pages than with people and does not apologize for the ratio. He did not speak immediately. He let the silence hold, and she, who understood silence, let him. 5 seconds. 10. The clock on the mantel measured them out in small, precise sounds. Then he looked at the book in her hands. He looked at the shelf she had taken it from. His gaze moved along the row of spines with a slowness that was almost physical, touching each one, counting. She watched him count. She watched him reach the end of the shelf and come back to the beginning and count again. Something shifted in his face. A muscle near his jaw moved very slightly, and his eyes gray. She saw now the gray of winter sky. The gray of old silver came back to her with a different weight behind them. "You have climbed my ladder," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, and dry and unhurried. She held the book against her chest like a shield, or perhaps like evidence. "I have," she said. "You are holding the Ashworth," he said, "the second printing." She looked down at the book in her hands as though she had forgotten it was there. She had not forgotten. She said, "The first printing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the room not toward her but toward the shelf below, where a ledger of some kind sat between 2 bookends, and drew it out. She recognized it, his acquisition log. He opened it, found a page, and read something she could not see. Then he closed it and looked at her again. And this time, the expression was unmistakable. It was the expression of a man who is rearranging everything he knows about a room he thought he understood. "The first printing," he repeated. "There are 11 copies known." She said nothing. He said, "You knew exactly where it was on the shelf." And then, because she was tired, because she had spent 3 hours being invisible, because the women in green silk had laughed, and the women in the doorway had laughed, and she had been polite about all of it, she said the rest of it too. "I did not need to look, because I wrote it, and the one beside it, and the 4 on the shelf above. And the 2 volumes of criticism that you keep, unless you have moved them, on the bottom shelf behind the armchair where the light is poorest, which has always irritated me because they deserve better light than that." The clock ticked. The dust motes turned in the late gold of the afternoon. He did not laugh. He did not disbelieve. He did not ask her to prove it. He looked at her the way one looks at a landscape one has seen in a painting and is now encountering for the first time in life, with a kind of wonder that is also a kind of reckoning. "You are E.L. Ashworth," he said. And she said, "Yes." And he said, "You are also Eliot Ash." She hesitated. The hesitation was its own answer. He nodded slowly. "The anonymous essays on reform," he said. She did not confirm. He did not need her to. The silence confirmed. He looked at the book she held against her chest, then at the ladder, then at the 11 shelves of his library that suddenly meant something different than they had 10 minutes ago. Then he said, "The comma on page 214, and she felt something crack open in her chest that she had not known was sealed, You noticed the comma, she said. It was not a question. He said, it has troubled me for 3 years. The clause requires a different pause. The Greek construction, yes, she said. And her voice was not quite steady. And she did not care that it was not quite steady, because in 20 years of scholarship, not one person had noticed the comma. Not one reviewer, not one correspondent, not one of the men who had praised the work in journals and letters and at dinners to which she was not invited. He had noticed. This man, in this room, with this collection that he had clearly built not for show but for the particular and private pleasure of understanding, he had noticed a misplaced comma on page 214, and it had troubled him. For 3 years, she descended the ladder carefully, one rung at a time, the book still in her hands. He did not offer to help her down. She was grateful for this. It meant he saw her as someone who did not require help, and this was more valuable to her in that moment than any compliment he might have offered. They stood facing each other in the late light, 6 feet apart, the width of the Turkish carpet between them, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Outside, the sound of the garden party continued the murmur of conversation, the clink of glasses, someone laughing the way people laugh when they are performing enjoyment rather than feeling it. Inside the library, the silence was a different texture. It was the silence of 2 people who have unexpectedly found themselves in the presence of someone who speaks their language, and the relief of it is so large that words seem inadequate and almost beside the point. He moved first. He crossed to a cabinet near the window, opened it, and withdrew 2 glasses and a bottle of something amber. He poured without asking. He brought her one. She took it. Their fingers did not touch. They did not need to. He raised his glass slightly, not quite a toast. To the comma, he said. To the comma, she said. They drank. He asked her to sit. Not in the way men usually asked her to sit with the implication that standing was unfeminine or that she must be tired, but in the way one scholar asks another, which is to say, I have questions, and they will take some time. She sat in the wing chair by the cold fireplace. He sat in the one opposite, and the cold hearth between them was oddly appropriate, she thought, because this was not a fire that had been lit yet. This was kindling. This was the arrangement of things in the hope that something might catch. He asked about the reform essays. Not whether she had written them, that was settled, but about the argument itself. The second essay's central claim about the relationship between property and representation. He asked with the precision of someone who had thought deeply about it. She answered with the precision of someone who had thought more deeply still. They talked for an hour. Then, too, the light shifted from gold to amber to the blue-gray of early evening, and neither of them moved to light a lamp. They sat in the gathering dark and argued not with heat but with the focused, pleasurable intensity of people testing ideas against each other, the way one tests a blade against a whetstone. He disagreed with her on one point. She conceded nothing. He respected this. She could see it in the way he leaned forward when she pressed her argument, the way his fingers steepled and his head tilted slightly to the left, as though physically receiving her words and turning them over. At some point she could not have said when. Because time had become unreliable in this room, he stood and lit the lamp on the table between them. The light it threw was warm and close, creating a circle that contained only the 2 chairs, the table, their glasses, and the space between them. Beyond the circle, the library was shadow and spine, and the faint gleam of gold lettering. He sat back down and looked at her, and in the lamplight his expression had changed again. It was no longer the scholar's intensity. It was something quieter. Something that made the room feel smaller. You have been here all weekend, he said. She said, since Friday. He said we were not introduced. She said, no. He said I would have remembered. She said nothing to this, because there was nothing safe to say. He said, I would have remembered because I have been trying to find E.L. Ashworth for 4 years. I have written letters to your publisher, who returned them unopened. To your academic correspondents, who claimed not to know your address, to the Royal Society, who informed me that you were not a member and could not be located through their offices. She listened to this. She had known about the letters, or some of them. Her publisher had mentioned them. A collector, he had said, dismissively. Some duke who wants to shake your hand. She had not pursued it. She had not thought it worth pursuing. She had been wrong. Why? She asked. He said, because I built this library around your work. She was quiet for a long time. He let her be quiet. He did not fill the silence with explanation or justification or the kind of anxious elaboration that men often offered when they sensed they had said something large. He simply let the statement sit in the room between them, solid and patient, like the books on the shelves. She looked at those shelves now with different eyes. She saw the organization not alphabetical, not by date, but thematic. Arguments and conversation with each other. Her philosophical work beside the natural philosophers who had informed it. Her criticism beside the literature it addressed. Her reform essays anonymous, unattributed, their authorship unknown to the world placed beside the political theory from which they grew. He had not merely collected her work, he had understood it. He had understood the architecture of her thinking, the way each piece connected to the others, the way her mind moved. He had built the library as a map of a mind he had never met, and he had been searching for the cartographer for 4 years. The sound of footsteps in the hallway broke the stillness. Margaret's voice, calling Eleanor's name with the slightly frantic pitch of a hostess who has misplaced a guest. Eleanor stood. He stood. The moment contracted. She was aware, suddenly and acutely, of how this looked, a woman alone with a man in a dimly lit room, both standing, the air between them thick with something that resembled intimacy, because it was intimacy, though not the kind anyone walking in would understand. Margaret appeared in the doorway. Her face registered surprise, then confusion, then the quick social calculation of a woman who knows the rules and is not sure whether they are being broken. "Eleanor," she said. "There you are. We are sitting down to dinner." Eleanor set the book carefully on the table beside her glass. She did not look at him. She did not need to. She felt his attention like heat from a fire at her back. She crossed the room toward Margaret, and as she reached the doorway, he spoke. "Miss Ashworth." She turned. He was standing by the lamp, and the light made his face half gold and half shadow, and he said, "After dinner, I would be honored if you would return. I have questions about the Ashworth. Several of them." She inclined her head. An acceptance that was not quite a promise. A door left open. Margaret took her arm and guided her toward the dining room, already asking in a low, urgent whisper what on earth she had been doing in the Duke's library. And Eleanor said, "Reading." And Margaret said, "Reading." And the word between them was both perfectly true and entirely inadequate. Dinner was an exercise in performance. 24 guests arranged around a table that gleamed with silver and crystal, the candlelight multiplying itself in every polished surface until the room seemed to contain 100 small fires. Eleanor was seated far from him. The placement was dictated by rank and connection, and her rank in this company was negligible, her connection only the slender thread of Margaret's marriage. She was between a clergyman who spoke at length about his rose garden and a young baronet who had opinions about horses. She listened to both with the patient, slightly distant courtesy she had perfected over years of such dinners, offering the occasional question that kept them talking and required nothing of her interior life. She ate the soup. She ate the fish. She moved food around her plate with the mechanical competence of someone whose mind is entirely elsewhere. She did not look at him. She did not need to. She was aware of where he sat the head of the table, 17 chairs away the way one is aware of magnetic north. Once, when the clergyman paused to butter his bread, she allowed herself to glance toward the far end. He was listening to the woman on his left, his head inclined politely, his fork idle in his hand. And then, as though he had felt her gaze the way she had felt his in the library, he looked up. Their eyes met across the length of the table, across the silver and the crystal and the 100 small fires. It lasted 2 seconds, perhaps 3. The clergyman resumed his account of aphids. Eleanor turned back to him and said, "How dreadful," and meant nothing by it, and thought about the comma on page 214. After dinner, the party separated in the customary fashion, the men to port and cigars, the women to the drawing room and coffee and the kind of conversation that is expected of women in drawing rooms. Eleanor drank her coffee. She listened to Margaret's mother-in-law discuss the difficulty of finding good linen. She listened to the woman in green silk whose name was Mrs. Fairchild and who was, Eleanor had gathered, considered a wit, offer her opinions on the latest novels with the confidence of someone who has read reviews rather than books. Eleanor did not contribute to this discussion, though she had written the novels being discussed. Not all of them. 2 of them, under yet another name. She finished her coffee. She set the cup down carefully on its saucer, aligned the handle with the rim, and stood. "Excuse me," she said. Margaret looked up. Mrs. Fairchild looked up. 3 other women looked up with the particular alertness of people who are hoping someone will do something worth discussing later. Eleanor smiled pleasantly and said, "I left my shawl in the library." She had not brought a shawl. It did not matter. The excuse was a door, and she walked through it. The library was dark when she returned, save for the single lamp he had lit earlier, still burning on the table between the wing chairs. He was already there. He had not waited for the port. He was standing by the shelf, her shelf, she thought, and the possessiveness of this thought startled her with a volume in his hands. The second book of criticism. The one about the relationship between narrative form and moral philosophy. He looked up when she entered, and the expression on his face was one she would remember for a long time. It was relief, as though he had been unsure she would come back. As though the dinner and the drawing room and the 17 chairs between them had been a test of something, and she had passed it simply by appearing in the doorway. She closed the door behind her. The click of the latch was very loud in the quiet room. He set the book down. She crossed to the wing chair and sat without being asked, because they were past that now. He sat opposite her. The cold fireplace between them. The lamp between them. The years of letters and scholarship and solitary thought between them, and also the strange, unprecedented absence of distance that happens when one mind recognizes another. He asked his questions. They were good questions, sharp, specific, revealing the depth of his reading and the seriousness of his thought. He asked about the argument in Chapter 7 of the philosophical work, the one that had been most criticized, the one she was most proud of. He asked whether the criticism had troubled her. She said, "No." She said, "The critics misread the claim because they began from an assumption I had already rejected in Chapter 3, and they did not notice the rejection because it was quiet." He smiled at this. A small smile, barely a movement of the mouth, but it reached his eyes. "Quiet," he said. "Yes, your work is often quiet in that way. It asks you to have been paying attention." She felt something warm unfurl in her chest, not vanity, something deeper, the warmth of being known, the specific, irreplaceable warmth of having done something difficult and private, and finding that one person, one understood not just what you made, but how you made it and why. She said, "Most people are not paying attention." He said, "Most people are not worth paying attention to." She laughed. It surprised them both. It was a real laugh, unguarded, and it changed the air in the room the way opening a window changes air. They talked until the lamp burned low. They talked about her work and his reading of it and the places where he thought she was wrong. And she told him he was wrong about her being wrong. And he said, "Prove it." And she did. And he conceded with a grace that made her like him more than anything else had. They talked about the reform essays and what had changed since she wrote them and what had not. They talked about the anonymous publication, and he asked carefully whether it was choice or necessity. "Both," she said. And he heard the weight under that word and did not press it. He said it should not have to be necessity. She said, "And yet." He said, "Yes, and yet." The lamp flickered. The wick was drowning. He stood and adjusted it, and the light steadied. And he remained standing for a moment, looking down at her with an expression she could not fully read but did not wish to look away from. "You should be known," he said. "Not the pen names. You." She looked at her hands in her lap. She said, "I am known, by the work." He said, "That is not the same thing." She said, "It has been enough." He said, "Has it?" It was not a question. She did not answer it. He walked her to the door of the library when the clock struck midnight. The house was quiet, most of the guests had retired, and the hallway was lit only by the sconces that the staff left burning through the night. At the door, he paused. She paused. They stood in the threshold, that liminal space between the private world they had made in the library and the public world that did not know it existed. He said, "I am hosting a lecture series in the autumn. 3 speakers. The subject is civic philosophy." She waited. He said, "I would like you to speak. Not Elliot Ash, not E.L. Ashworth. You." Eleanor Ashworth, under your own name, as yourself. She felt the weight of this, the risk, the exposure, the years of careful anonymity that had protected her work from dismissal and her person from scrutiny. She felt all of it, and she also felt the particular exhaustion of carrying a secret that costs more to keep than it would cost to set down. She said, "I will think about it," he said. "That is all I ask." Then he said, "Good night, Miss Ashworth." And the way he said her name, the real one, the full one, with a gravity that was almost tender, made it sound like something valuable, like something that deserved better light. She did not sleep well. The bed was comfortable, the room was quiet, and she lay awake until 3 in the morning, looking at the ceiling and thinking about commas, thinking about the comma on page 214 that had troubled him for 3 years. Thinking about what it meant that someone had read her work with that degree of attention, not skimming for arguments to deploy in conversation, not mining for quotations to make himself sound clever, but reading the way she wrote, carefully, slowly, with an ear for the rhythm and a sensitivity to the placement of every pause. She thought about the library, about the shelves arranged as a map of her mind, about the 4 years of letters, returned and unanswered, about the expression on his face when she told him who she was. Not surprise, exactly, something closer to inevitability, as though he had always known that the person who wrote those books would look like this, would stand like this, would climb his ladder without asking permission, and find the error on page 214 without needing to search for it. She thought about Mrs. Fairchild in the drawing room discussing novels she had not read, written by a woman she had laughed at in a doorway. She thought about this without bitterness. Bitterness was a waste of the same energy that could be used for thinking, and Eleanor had always preferred thinking. In the morning, she came down to breakfast early. The dining room was nearly empty, only the clergyman, absorbed in a newspaper, and a young woman she did not know, eating toast with the methodical determination of someone avoiding conversation. Eleanor took coffee and a piece of bread and sat near the window where the light was good. She had brought a small notebook, she always carried one, and she wrote for 20 minutes, capturing an idea that had come to her in the night about the relationship between anonymity and authority, about the paradox of a voice that gains power, precisely because it cannot be dismissed as female, and what this says about the listeners rather than the speaker. She was deep in a sentence when the chair opposite her moved. She looked up. He was sitting down, a cup of coffee in his hand, his hair slightly disordered in a way that suggested he, too, had slept poorly. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He did not ask what she was writing. He simply sat with his coffee and looked out the window at the garden, and the silence between them was comfortable in a way that silence between near strangers should not be. After a while, he said, "I have thought of another question about Chapter 7. She said, "Only one?" And he smiled, that small, restrained smile that she was beginning to understand was his version of a laugh, and said, "To begin with." They walked in the garden after breakfast. It was not planned she had gone out for air, and he had appeared on the path ahead of her, and they had fallen into step together with the naturalness of people who have been walking together for years rather than hours. The garden was beautiful in the way that wealth makes things beautiful, every hedge precise, every border considered, the roses fat and imperious on their stems. She said, "Your garden is very controlled." He said, "My gardener is very determined." She said, "Do you prefer it controlled?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I prefer things that reveal their nature honestly." A pause. She felt the subtext of this settle between them like pollen. They walked on. He showed her the walled kitchen garden, where herbs grew in orderly rows and a cat slept on the warm stones of the path. He showed her the old orchard, where the trees were gnarled and unpruned and the fruit fell where it chose. "I prefer this part," he said. She said, "Yes, because it is not performing." He looked at her. He said, "Precisely." The cat had followed them and was winding between their feet, and she bent to touch its head. And when she straightened, he was watching her with that expression again, the one that was half recognition and half something else, something that made the morning air feel warmer than it was. The weekend ended as weekends do, with departures and carriages, and the particular flurry of servants and luggage that marks the dissolution of a temporary world. Eleanor packed her bag. She placed the small notebook on top, the new pages filled with the cramped, rapid handwriting that was hers alone. Margaret appeared in her doorway, pink-cheeked and slightly breathless, to say that the carriage would be ready in half an hour. Eleanor thanked her. Margaret lingered. She said, "You spent a great deal of time in the library." Eleanor said, "Yes." Margaret said, "With His grace." Eleanor said, "He has an excellent collection." Margaret opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and said, "Eleanor, are you?" And Eleanor said, "Reading." "Margaret, I was reading." And Margaret laughed uncertainly and went away. And Eleanor closed her bag and looked out the window at the garden one last time, at the precise hedges, and the controlled borders, and the fat roses, and beyond them, just visible, the wild orchard where the fruit fell where it chose. He was in the entrance hall when she came down. He was saying goodbye to other guests, the clergyman, the baronet, Mrs. Fairchild in her green silk, now wearing a traveling coat and an expression of satisfied importance. Eleanor waited. She was good at waiting. She had been waiting, in one way or another, for 20 years, waiting for the world to be ready for what she had to say, waiting for her work to find its readers, waiting for someone to notice the comma. Mrs. Fairchild swept past her without acknowledgement. The clergyman nodded vaguely, and then the hall was empty except for the two of them and the footman by the door, who was professionally invisible. He crossed to her. He held out his hand. She took it. The handshake was brief, correct, and entirely unremarkable to anyone watching, but his thumb pressed, once against her knuckle, a tiny, deliberate pressure that said, "I know who you are. I know what you have done. I have not forgotten." She released his hand. She said, "I have thought about your lecture series." He waited. She said, "Yes." And his face, that watchful, angular, composed face, broke into something that was not quite a smile, and not quite anything she had words for. It was simply openness, the sudden absence of guard. He said, "Good." She said, "I have conditions." He said, "I would expect nothing less." She almost smiled. Almost. She picked up her bag and the footman opened the door, and the autumn light came flooding in like a promise. The lecture was in October. She had 4 months to prepare, which was more than she needed and less than her nerves suggested. She wrote the lecture in 3 weeks, revised it for 2 months, and spent the final 3 weeks pretending she had not already memorized every word. It was, she decided, going to be about the comma. Not literally, not only, but about what the comma represented, about the difference between being read and being understood, about the space between a pause and a silence, and how meaning lives in that space, and how power determines who is allowed to place the pause and who must simply accept where it falls. She wrote it under her own name, Eleanor Ashworth, the full, unabbreviated, unmistakable name on the front page where anyone could see it. It felt like standing in a room without armor. It felt like the first morning she had ever written before the pen names, before the necessity, when the words were just the words and the name was just the name, and neither of them had learned yet to be afraid of each other. He wrote to her twice during those 4 months. The letters were formal in structure and intimate in content, the handwriting precise, the paper heavy, the arguments sharp and unsparing. He disagreed with her, in the first letter, on a point she had made about the nature of intellectual courage. She disagreed with his disagreement in her reply. He sent a second letter conceding half the point and pressing her further on the other half. She pressed back. Their correspondence had the quality of fencing, not aggressive, not hostile, but alert, responsive, each stroke testing the other's reach. She kept the letters in the drawer of her writing desk, beneath the current manuscript. She did not reread them. She did not need to. She remembered every word the way she remembered the placement of books on shelves by feel, by weight, by the particular shape they made in the dark. October came. The lecture hall was full, which surprised her, and warm, which did not. She stood behind the curtain at the side of the stage and listened to the murmur of the audience, and counted. She was always counting 143 seats, and at least 130 of them occupied, and somewhere among them, him. She did not look for him. She did not need to find him in order to know he was there. The moderator introduced her. The full name, no abbreviation, no pseudonym, no polite fiction. Eleanor Ashworth, philosopher, critic, and author of, and he listed them. All of them, every title, and the murmur in the audience shifted to something sharper, something that contained surprise and reassessment, and, from certain quarters, the particular discomfort of people who are realizing they have praised work they would have dismissed had they known its source. She walked onto the stage. The light was very bright. The silence was very large. She thought about the library, about the lamplight, about the cold fireplace and the 2 wing chairs, and the man who had said, "You should be known." She opened her mouth. She spoke. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not use notes. She did not need them. The argument unfolded the way her arguments always did, carefully, precisely, building from small observations to large claims, from the specific to the universal, from the comma on page 214 to the nature of attention itself and what it means to be heard. The audience was quiet in the way that audiences are quiet when they are genuinely listening rather than merely waiting for their turn to speak. She felt it, the attention in the room, the particular weight of 130 minds focused on her words, and it was not unlike the feeling in the library, the feeling of being known, but larger, wider, shared. When she finished, the silence held for 3 seconds. She counted, and then the applause came, and it was real, not polite, not the measured acknowledgement of an adequate performance, real. She stood in it and let it wash over her and thought, 20 years. 20 years of writing in rooms alone, 20 years of pen names and returned letters and anonymous brilliance. And here, finally, the sound of people hearing her without the barrier of their own assumptions. She did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who cried in public, but she felt the crack in her chest again, the same one from the library, and this time it did not close. He found her afterward, in the reception room where people were drinking wine and asking her questions with the slightly dazed enthusiasm of an audience that has been genuinely moved. He did not push through the crowd. He waited at the edge of it, holding a glass he was not drinking, until the others dispersed. Then he approached. She was sitting by then, in a chair near the window, her hands folded in her lap, the adrenaline receding and leaving her pleasantly exhausted. He sat in the chair beside her. He did not speak immediately. He set his glass on the windowsill and looked at her the way he had looked at her in the library, with recognition, with attention, with the quiet intensity of someone who is not merely seeing, but reading. Then he said, "The comma." She smiled. She said, "The comma." He said, "You built an entire philosophy of attention around a misplaced comma on page 214. She said, "It was always there. I simply finally said it aloud." He was quiet. Then he said, very low, so that only she could hear, "I am glad you said it aloud." And she understood that he was not only talking about the lecture. The news of the lecture spread in the way that such news does, through letters, through journals, through the steady accumulation of one person telling another who tells another. Mrs. Fairchild, it was reported, had received the information at a dinner party and had gone quite white, which Eleanor chose to regard as a compliment. The publisher wrote, somewhat sheepishly, to inquire whether Miss Ashworth might be willing to reissue the collected works under her own name. The Royal Society sent a letter that managed to be simultaneously congratulatory and apologetic without explicitly acknowledging what it was apologizing for. Eleanor read this letter at her desk, beside the window that overlooked her small garden, not a duke's garden, not precise or controlled, but hers, with its unruly lavender and its single stubborn apple tree, and she allowed herself a moment of something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite vindication. It was simpler than either of those. It was the feeling of putting down something heavy that she had carried for a very long time. She accepted the publisher's offer. She accepted an invitation to lecture again in the spring. She accepted, after some deliberation, an invitation to dine at a certain house in the northeast of England, where the library occupied a former ballroom and the shelves were walnut, and the carpet was Turkish and old enough to be soft as moss. She accepted this last invitation with a one-line note that said only, "I have thought of another question about Chapter 7. His reply, which arrived 2 days later, said only one? And she laughed alone in her study, the sound startling the cat on the windowsill, and she did not try to explain to the cat why she was laughing, because some things do not require explanation. Some things simply are, the way commas simply are, placed where they belong, marking the pause that gives the meaning room to breathe. The following spring, a new volume appeared on the Duke's shelves, not purchased from a bookseller, not acquired through a catalog, but delivered by hand on a Tuesday afternoon in April by a woman who knew exactly where it belonged. She placed it herself, on the third shelf, between the philosophical works and the criticism, and he stood below and watched her climb the ladder and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, because they had long since passed the point where silence required filling. She descended, and he was there, and the library was quiet, and the afternoon light fell in long panels across the floor, and the comma on page 214 had been corrected in this edition. Finally, after all these years, the pause placed where it belonged. She stood beside him and looked at the shelf, her shelf, their shelf, the accumulation of 20 years of thought and 4 seasons of being known, and he took her hand, briefly, simply, with the same deliberate pressure as that first handshake in the entrance hall, and she let him, and the light was good, and the books were in order, and outside the window the wild orchard was blooming. If you have ever carried something brilliant in silence, if you have ever done your finest work behind a name that was not your own, or behind no name at all, and wondered whether anyone would ever read with enough attention to truly hear what you meant, then perhaps you understand what it is to have someone look at you the way he looked at her in that library, not at your work, not at the persona or the performance, at you, at the mind behind the comma, at the person who placed the pause. I hope someone has read you that carefully. I hope someone has noticed the comma. And if they have not yet, if you are still waiting, still writing, still carrying the weight of your own unrecognized brilliance, then I hope this story was, for a few minutes, the kind of company that makes the carrying lighter. Come back to the fire when you are ready. There is always another story here, another quiet evening, another voice waiting to say, I see you, I know what you have done, and it matters. Rest well tonight. The next story will be here when you return.